Hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream. We're going to be continuing Echo today. Let me just let me put this on for you while I get things ready. Okay, I have the book with me now. Let us get started. Let's see, where did we last leave off? We were on page 22. Let's begin reading. For our journey to save a soul on the brink of death cannot begin until you do. Eanes nodded. It is our only hope of ever escaping the spell. I promise, said Otto, for he wanted to go home. But how will I know when or to whom? The three sisters surrounded him and whispered, You will know. Otto handed the harmonica to Eanes. She played a short melody, taking the instrument from her lips. She passed it to her sister. Zui played a different tune. As she performed, Otto heard both songs at the same time. Zui passed the harmonica to Dri, who played yet another song. That isn't possible, said Otto. I hear 3 melodies at once. Satisfied and in harmony, the sisters said, It is possible. The sky had deepened. Night loomed. Otto whispered, How will I find my way? I'm afraid of the dark. Eins stood tall and said, Your fate is not yet sealed. Even in the darkest night, a star will shine, a bell will chime, a path will be revealed. Trey handed him the small instrument. Otto whispered, But it's only a harmonica. Oh, it is so much more, said Eins. When you play it, you breathe in and out, just as you would to keep your body alive. Have you ever considered that one person might play the mouth harp and pass along her strength and vision and knowledge? So that the next musician who plays it might feel the same, said Zui. It is true. When you play, you will see and find your way. You will have the fortitude to carry on. Dre nodded. And you will forever be joined to us, to all who have played the harp and to all who will play it, by the silken thread of destiny. Otto was overwhelmed by their strange suggestions. Forever joined by the silken thread of destiny? Their talking confounded him. His head ached and he felt woozy. I'm ever so tired. I want to go home. And you will, said Eins. Slumber now, said Zui. Sweet dreams, whispered Dre, her voice hypnotic. He swooned and dropped to the pine needles. When Otto awoke, the sun blazed overhead. He sat up and found himself in a thicket at the narrow side of a path. In his hand, he still clutched the harmonica, but the book was nowhere to be found, nor were Eins, Zui, and Dre. Had they kept the book and brought him to this spot and left him? Was the path the way home? All day he stumbled along the narrow trail, overgrown with wild geranium and thistle, until the sun disappeared behind the trees. The knot on his head throbbed. Darkness crept in. Weak and frightened, he began to give up hope, until he remembered the harmonica. He lifted it to his lips and began to play a simple tune. The unusual tone of the instrument filled him with a peculiar and euphonic well-being. He felt less alone as he walked. He whispered, Your fate is not yet sealed. Even in the darkest night, a star will shine, a bell will chime, a path will be revealed. Overhead, the tree branches slowly parted. Stars shone down, lighting the way. He put one foot in front of the other. Had the sisters infused with the harmonica with the strength to carry on? Were they there with him, in spirit? He thought he heard the voices had stopped. Was it eins, zwei, and drei? Or wolves and bears and wild boar? Or just the forest playing tricks with his mind? His heart raced. Otto took a giant breath and blew hard into the harmonica. The chord pierced the night. The forest grew silent, as if the world stood still. Otto heard the voices again, calling. His name! Someone was calling his name! In the distance, he saw spots of light, bobbing like fireflies. He pushed forward, stumbling into the pear orchard. He found it crowded with townspeople, lanterns held high, combing the edge of the woods. "Here! I'm here!" he yelled. A song rang out. "He's found! He's found!" 2 men ran to him, clasped their arms together to make a sling, swooped him up, and carried him to the others. His father appeared, and Otto collapsed into his arms. People cheered, and children crowded around, patting him on the back. Mathalide was there, and her eyes filled at the sight of him. Otto was so shaken he could not talk. He could only bury his face into his father's chest and cry. Later, at home, he whispered the entire story to his mother and father, beginning with the book and the harmonica he had bought from the gypsy. "Eins, zwei, and drei saved me. They guided me out of the forest." His parents looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. "There now," said his mother. "There have been no gypsies passing through our village of late. You must have found the harmonica in the forest, left by another mischievous child. And you were not gone overnight. You've only been missing since morning. Rest now. You have a bad bump on your head." He fell asleep with the harmonica cradled in his hand. After Otto recovered, he carried the harmonica wherever he went. He told his friends and anyone else who would listen about eins, zwei, and drei. After several weeks, people became weary of the telling and began to laugh and dismiss him. Only Mathalide never tired of hearing the mysterious tale. Concerned, his father sat him down. "People are beginning to think you are affected. You were lost, and you saved yourself by signaling with that harmonica. That is all. I do not want to hear another word about a gypsy, a book, imaginary sisters, or a magic harmonica." To please his parents, Otto kept the harmonica out of sight and never carried it from his house again. He stopped mentioning the 3 sisters and their story. Soon, life with his family went back to how it had been before he was lost in the forest. But whenever he felt afraid, he secretly took the harmonica from its hiding spot, played a song, and escaped into its reverie, feeling the familiar sense of happiness and comfort, that peculiar and euphoric well-being. Each time, every detail of the story in the book and the events in the forest flooded back to him. The king's trickery, the midwife's journey, the witch's spell, his encounter with eins, zwei, and drei, and his promise to them. He never forgot that he'd been entrusted with their future, or that the harmonica had been carried their deepest hopes to be free, to be loved, and to belong somewhere beyond a tree circle, so that the rest of their story might someday be written. He never forgot that their journey to save a soul at the moment of death would not begin until he sent the harmonica out into the world. When the time was right, he was the messenger. Echo, a novel by Pamonos Ryan. Decoration by Danira Mitalova. Scholastic Press, New York. Chapter 1. October 1933. Trossingen, Baden-Württemberg, Germany. Brahms Lullaby. Music by Johannes Brahms. Lyrics from Dens Kuban Wunderhome. Lullaby and good night, with roses bedlight, with lilies overspread, is my baby's wee bed. Lay thee down now and rest, and may thy slumber be blessed. Lay thee down now and rest, may thy slumber be blessed. If anyone would actually like me to sing the song, feel free to comment. I forgot that I left the chat here. No one commented. It's fine. Let's see if we can take it with us. I don't think we can. Yeah, it's stuck here. Oops. There we go. Hi, anyone watching? Hello. I don't know if anyone is watching or check, but I don't want to stop for any longer. Let's read again. In a town between the Black Forest and the Swabian Alps, Frederick Schmidt stood on the threshold of a half-timbered house, pretending to be brave. From his vantage, he looked across the rooftops of Trossingen towards the castle-like factory looming above the town. Within its walls, a smokestack rose higher than the tallest gable and puffed a white cloud, a beacon against the gray sky. Father stood behind him in the doorway. "Son, you know the way. We've walked it hundreds of times. Remember, you have just as much right to be on the street as the next person. Uncle Gunter will be waiting for you at the front gates." Frederick nodded and stood taller. "Don't worry, Father. I can do it." He wanted to believe his own words, that something as simple as walking to work by himself would be easy, that he wouldn't need Father's Hulk-like presence shielding him from the frightened, or steering him around like the gawkers. Frederick took a few steps towards the street, and then turned to wave. Father's hair billowed from his head like a gray halo, giving him a wild look. It suited him. He raised his hand in return and smiled at Frederick, but it wasn't his usual jovial smile. It was half-hearted and worried. Were those tears in his eyes? Frederick went back and pulled him into a hug, inhaling his persistent smell of bow rosin and anise indulgence. "I'll be fine, Father. It's your first day of retirement, and you should enjoy it. Will you join the pigeon feeders?" Father laughed, holding Frederick at arm's length. "Heavens, no. Do I look like I'm ready for the park bench?" Frederick shook his head, happy he'd lighten the mood. "What will you do with your time? I hope you'll think about performing again." Long ago, Father had played cello for the Berlin Philharmonic, but he set aside that life when he married and had children, taking a more practical job at the factory. Shortly after Frederick was born, Mother died and Father was left to raise him and his sister, Elizabeth, alone. "I won't likely perform with an orchestra," said Father, "but don't you worry, I'll have plenty to keep me busy. My books, my cello students, concerts, and I intend to start a chamber music ensemble. Father, you have the energy of 3 men. That is a good thing. With your sister coming home today, Elizabeth will fill our house with decoratives, and Uncle needs stamina for that, to be sure. I intend to convince her to take up piano again, so we can resume our Friday get-togethers, beginning tonight. I miss them." Frederick missed those evenings too. For as long as he could remember, every Friday after dinner, Uncle Gunter, Father's youngest brother, came in for dessert and brought his accordion. Father played cello, Frederick harmonica, though in truth cello was his instrument too, and Elizabeth played piano. Father and Elizabeth would argue about everything, from choice to the songs to order in which they were played. Frederick had given up trying to determine whether Elizabeth and Father were opposites in either or simply alike. Still, those were his happiest memories. The polkas, the folk songs, the spontaneous singing and laughing, even the bickering. Now Elizabeth would be home from nursing school for 3 whole months. He couldn't wait for the late night talks, or passing a novel back and forth, taking turns reading it out loud, and their Sunday afternoon card games of boikino around the kitchen table with Father and Uncle Gunter. The past year hadn't been the same without Elizabeth's mothering and bossing around and cooking. His mouth was watered just thinking about her cooking. "Do you think she missed us as much as we missed her?" asked Frederick. Father smiled. "How could she not?" He pointed at Frederick towards the street and patted his back. "Have a good day at work, son, and don't forget to—" "I know, Father. Look up." When Frederick was around the corner, he did the opposite. He shoved his hands into his pockets, hunched his shoulders, and tilted his right cheek toward the ground. Father would have never tolerated his posture, but this made Frederick feel less conspicuous, even if he was more vulnerable to things in his path. Besides, he often took a lost peffening while looking down. Soon enough, he stumbled over a bundle of newspapers that had been tossed toward the storefront. He braced himself for impact on the building and read the headline. "Parliament passes law." Frederick groaned. Another law for Father to criticize. Since Frederick didn't attend regular school, Father insisted they read the newspaper together, every night as part of his studies. He could not count the times in the recent months that Father had tossed the paper aside, disgusted with the new Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, and his Nazi party. Father had been a member of the German Free Thinkers League until a few months ago, when Hitler outlawed the organization. Just last night, after reading yet another article, Father had paced around the kitten and ranted. Is there no room in this country for more than one way of thinking? Hitler bullies the parliament to make laws on whims. Hitler takes away all civil rights and gives his stormtroopers freedom to question anyone for any reason. Hitler wants to cleanse the population for a pure German race. What did it all mean? What was a pure German race? Clear-skinned and perfect? Frederick touched his face and he felt his stomach tighten with worry, especially since he was neither. He ran his fingers through his hair, which did him no service. It was thick, blonde, and tightly curled. He could feel it frizzing in the damp air, just like Father's. No matter how long he let it grow, it stuck out instead of down. If only he had a straight hair, he could let it drape across his cheek, but there was no hiding his blotchy birthmark. It was as if an imaginary line had been drawn down the middle of his face and neck, and on one side, his skin was like everyone else's. On the other, a painter had dabbled shades of purple, red, and brown, turning his cheek into a molted plum. He knew he looked horrid. How could he blame people for staring or being frightened? At the next corner, he turned down the thoroughfare. When he reached the music conservatory, he could hear someone practicing piano in an upper story. Beethoven's For Else. For this, he stopped and lifted his head, becoming lost in the music. Unconsciously, his hand rose and bounced to the time of the song. Frederick smiled as he pretended the musician was following his direction. He closed his eyes and imagined notes sprinkling down, washing his face clean. A car horn startled him. He shoved his hands into his pockets, lowered his head, and resumed walking. He kicked at a rock in his path, feeling the familiar mix of hope and dread. His audition at the conservatory, for which he had been preparing for as long as he had memory, was just after the New Year. What if he did not perform well? Yet, which one would be worse? To be accepted or refused? A weight pressed his heart. How could he want something and fear it so much at the same time? He took a deep breath and kept walking. As he approached the schoolyard, he gave himself his usual lecture. Don't look, don't pay attention. He tried to bother himself with the things Father always said. One foot in front of the other, keep moving forward, ignore the ignorant. But without Father at his side, his heart pounded and his breathing quickened. He faltered and glanced up. A group of boys huddled together on the steps, pointing at him, snickering and making faces in mock horror. He shaded his face with his hand and hung his head. He took longer strides, weaving around people until he was running. Frederick! He almost fell over Uncle Gunther. Good morning, nephew. He put an arm around Frederick's shoulder and drew him close. Frederick tried to catch his breath. Good morning. Aren't you happy to see me? Because I'm happy to see you. Come. He guided Frederick through the factory gates. I'm moving over to your father's table today. We'll be side by side. Is that agreeable? Uncle Gunther was his usual jovial self, and it steadied Frederick. Of course, he said. It is what I hoped. As he and Uncle Gunther crossed the cobblestone square, Frederick could feel his heart beating and breathing calm. The towering buildings and the stone paths and arched passageways all meant safety, and the fat water tower, a stodgy obelisk standing sentry over the entire enclave, was his guardian in disguise. Part of him wished he could stay and work at the factory forever. The other part of him wished his life had been taken a different course, that he'd have been a boy who went to real school and had friends his own age and an ordinary, remarkable face. But fate had stepped in his path, and when he was only 8 years old, he became the youngest and smallest apprentice in the biggest harmonica factory in the world. On that morning, 4 years ago, Frederick had followed Elizabeth in the primary play yard as he had any other day. As usual, he steered him to a bench away from the others. He knew what he was supposed to do, stay there and sit still. But the night before, Father had taken him to the ballet to hear the orchestra, and the music had stayed with him, as it always did. Every movement, every refrain from Take's fleeting Sleeping Beauty still playing in his head, especially the waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Frederick hummed it all the way to the school. No amount of shushing from Elizabeth could make him stop. While she checked his lunch and pulled his sweater tighter around him, he raised his arms, waving them to conduct an imaginary orchestra. Elizabeth took both of his hands in hers, eyes pleading. She said, "Frederick, please, don't make it more difficult for yourself. You already have enough problems." "I hear music," he said, "and I hear the names the others call you if you continue to wave at the sky. Do you want the boys to throw rocks at you again?" He shook his head and looked up at her. "Elizabeth, they call me Monster Boy." "I know," she said, stroking his hair. "Don't listen to them. What do I always say? They're not my family, and my family tells me the truth." "That's right, and I say you'll be a talented musician, and someday you will be a conductor. But for now, you must only practice at home. Remember the trick I taught you?" Frederick nodded. "If I think I might wave my arms at school, stuff my hands under my legs, and sit at them." "Right," said Elizabeth. "Now stay here until the teacher rings the bell. I have to go, or I'll be late for class." She kissed his cheek. Frederick watched her walk towards the secondary school, her blonde curls bouncing behind her. He tucked his hands beneath his legs, but the music from the concert pestered him until he couldn't resist any longer. He freed his hands and swished an imaginary baton. Closing his eyes, he escaped into the rhythmic waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He didn't realize he was creating a spectacle, or that all the children in the schoolyard were watching him. He was so caught up in the music he never heard the laughing or the taunting, or the boys running up behind him, until it was too late. The next morning, before the bell, Father marched into headmaster's office with Frederick limping alongside him. "I want you to see what your students did to my son yesterday. A lip so swollen he can barely talk, a cut on his forehead that had to be stitched, and a broken wrist. He'll wear the swing for weeks." The headmaster leaned in on his chair, his hands resting on his belly. "Mr. Schmidt, the incident was nothing more than boys being boys, a little playground bullying. Frederick needs to toughen. Skirmishes are the best thing for him if he's learned to defend himself. We try to keep an eye on these things, but given his disfigurement..." Father's voice tightened. "It is only a birthmark." Headmaster's smile tightened. "Of course, but the hand-waving isn't the only issue. His teachers has complained that he finishes his mathematics long before the others, and that he whispers to the person in the desk next to him." Father looked at him and Frederick nodded. "Well, he finishes before all the others," said Father. "Perhaps the teachers give him some extra work, or allow him to read. Wouldn't that occupy him and prevent him from talking to the others?" "I don't think you understand," said the headmaster, turning his gaze to Frederick. "Can you tell us who sits next to you?" With a fat lip, he could only mumble the name. "Hansel." The headmaster turned to Father and smirked. "Mr. Schmidt, no one sits in the desk next to him. It is empty. So who exactly is this Hansel?" Father knew. It was the same person Frederick always pretended to talk to at home. The clever Hansel from the fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel, who along with his sister survived the witch and escaped from the dark, treacherous woods. Hansel, his friend, whose courage Frederick wished he had. "He was an imagination!" yelled Father. "Your son is not unusual, and is possibly defiant," said the headmaster. "You are right about one thing," said Father. "He is not unusual, but look at his exam marks, and you'll see he is not deficient. I'm not here to argue at this point, though. I'm here to tell you from now on. I will teach him, and at the end of the year, you will procure the exams and a teacher to administer them." The headmaster's smile disappeared. "That is not acceptable." Father pounded his fists on the headmaster's desk.
What your students did to my son is not acceptable, and I'm prepared to go to your superiors.
The headmaster tensed. He lifted a file from his desk and opened it. Well then, if that's how you wish to proceed, I wish to see that his physician is Dr. Braun. I am sending him a letter asking him to recommend the boy for a psychiatric evaluation. I expect there is more wrong with him than what we've discussed. There's a place for children like him, the home of the unfortunates.
That's an asylum, said Father.
Frederick clutched Father's side. Elizabeth had told him about such places, where they put lunatics and took away all their clothes except for undergarments. Could he really be sent there for conducting an imaginary orchestra and talking to a make-believe friend? His head throbbed. Father's voice shook.
All this because he's not like the others? I am done being reasonable.
He put an arm around Frederick, ushering him from the office down the hallway, now crowded with children. Frederick saw the stares and heard the remarks.
Monster boy is leaving. Moron. Belongs in a zoo.
What was to become of him? Elizabeth went to school all day. Father worked at the factory. Would Father leave him alone or put him away? Outside, on the front steps, he caught Father's sleeve and tugged. Father stopped and leaned down. Frederick cupped his hand over Father's ear and whispered, "Where will I go, Father, if I'm too dreadful for school?" Father's eyes filled with tears. He kissed him on the forehead. "Don't worry, I will take care of this. Come, we must stop at the factory so I might tell them why I did not come in for work today." Frederick sat outside a windowed office while Father spoke to several white-coated supervisors. He couldn't hear what Father said, but he could see his guarded, animated gestures, his pleading expressions. Afterward, Father shook hands with each of the men. One blotted his eyes with an handkerchief. The door opened when super fires fled out, and the one with the handkerchief leaned down and put a hand on Frederick's shoulder. "My name is Ernst. Your father is going to take you home to rest for now, but starting tomorrow, this is where you'll come. Welcome to the firm." He shook Frederick's uninjured hand. Frederick didn't know what that meant, but he whispered, "Yes, sir." As they walked home, Father explained, "I will oversee your schoolwork from now on. Every morning during the week, you will apprentice at the factory to learn about harmonica making. In the afternoons, you'll complete assignments. I'll give you a table next to my workstation, and you'll continue your music lessons with me on weekends. Do you understand?" Frederick's wound stung and his head ached. He didn't answer. Father stopped and knelt in front of him. "Frederick, do you understand? Where I go, you will go." He looked at Father, unbelieving. He was not going to an asylum or back to school. He would no longer have to guess the safest route to the classroom or dodge the food thrown at him at lunchtime. He would not have to determine which corner of the play yard to provide the most protection. He smiled, tears rolling down his cheeks. Father carefully lifted Frederick into his arms and carried him. On the street, a car honked 3 times. The rhythm of Takanari's watch took hold again. Looking back across Father's shoulder, he lifted an imaginary baton with his good arm and conducted. When the wind brushed against his face, Frederick felt a lightness, a weightlessness, as if, bit by bit, the dread and worry that has always burdened him were taking flight. Had Father not been holding him, he too might have floated away on the wind, like a dandelion's white-seated parachutes. The energy inside the factory is palpable. Machinery clacked and wheezed. Wheels and cogs married as Frederick and Uncle Gunter entered the massive hall, part warehouse and part assembly room floor. Frederick listened to the comforting whir of saws, interrupted by the staccato sound of metal being punched. Doors to the testing room opened and closed, and for the briefest moments he heard the compressors sigh and hiss as air was pumped through the harmonicas and the notes slid up and down the scale. He searched for a giant A-frame ladder that migrated around the floor and pictured himself standing on the top, 2 stories high, directing the percussive symphony. At his work table, he put on his apron and glanced at paper tackled to the wall. "What is that?" asked Uncle Gunter. "New vocabulary words from Miss Stayn't," said Frederick. "Every Friday she posts the words. The following Thursday she gives me an exam."
Mr. Carl from accounting approached. Frederick reached into his pocket, pulled out his folded mathematics homework, smoothed it, and handed it to him. Mr. Carl smiled. Stop by after lunch, Frederick, and we'll review it. He waved and walked away. On his heels, Anselm, a new young clerk, appeared, with a box of harmonicas for Frederick's table. Mr. Inchman from the third floor asked me to remind you to come to his office this afternoon to start reading the Odyssey. Must be nice to have private tutors, eh, Frederick? And during work hours, too. Frederick avoided his eyes. What was Anselm's issue with him? They'd only exchanged a few pleasantries since he had begun working at the factory, but he seemed to enjoy goading Frederick. It's not during my work hours. I'm only paid for the mornings. But Mr. Eichmann is paid all day. Quite the disruption to his work. Everyone should be rallying together for the good of Germany and common man. Don't you agree? I read to him while he works, said Frederick, and it's all been approved by the supervisors. Whatever you say, Frederick, said Anselm. You're some kind of favorite around here, aren't you? You know, the new Germany doesn't like favorites. We should all be one mind and focus for the fatherland, for Hitler's family, so we can be let out of darkness. He swaggered away, whistling. Uncle Gunther stepped closer, keeping his close low. Ignore him, let him talk, but keep your feelings to yourself. He's an arrogant Hitlerite. I don't care for this new young breed that worships Hitler like a god. Nor does father, said Frederick. As we all well know, Uncle Gunther smiled. Anselm's right about one thing, nephew. You are a favorite. Apparently Mr. Adler and Mr. Engel in shipping have been arguing about which of them is most suited to teach you secondary history. They have all adopted you, Frederick. Don't let anyone make you feel bad about that. Uncle Gunther waved a finger at him and winked. But don't ever forget who your real family is. Who taught you to ride a bicycle? You. And who taught you to play the harmonica? You. And who started the factory harmonica club on your behalf? Frederick laughed. I remember. You have nothing to worry about, Uncle. He watched him hang his tools above the table, using a crate as a step stool. Uncle Gunther was shorter and much rounder than father. You're coming for dessert tonight, I hope? Uncle Gunther raised an eyebrow. I won't miss one of Elizabeth's strudels. How do you think my fingers got as plump as sausages? Frederick turned to his work, smiling. His most recent job was to inspect each instrument for flaws. If the harmonica was in perfect order, he polished it and placed it into a slim cardboard box with a lid. He held one of the mouth harps in the palm of his hand and examined it. I'm going to take a drink really quick. How simple an instrument, yet with such capacity. He studied the shiny metal cover plates and the black painted pearwood. He turned the harmonica over and ran his thumb across the symmetrical holes. What an improbable journey from pear tree to lumber yard, to assembly room floor, to something that could make music. Every few hours a clerk came by to pick up Frederick's harmonicas as they went to be put into narrow cases of a dozen. The cases were packed in cartons, the cartons packed in crates, and the crates loaded into a horse-drawn cart, which were hauled them to an electric train. Then they were transferred to cars behind a steam engine, which chugged off to the seaport of Bremen and offloaded into a cargo ship. This model, the Marine Band, was destined for a port in the United States of America. Frederick shined the harmonica in his hand and fitted it in its box, whispering a wish for happy travels. Gut Reis. His supervisor, Ernst, who was also one of the factory owners, approached with his hands in the pockets of his white coat he wore over his suit when he was on the factory floor. That is what I have always admired about the Schmidt family. You treat each mouth harp like a friend. Good morning, sir, said Frederick. We hope this arrangement works for you, Frederick. He nodded to Uncle Gunther. Your uncle's one of the best craftsmen in the company. We thought it would make sense for you to be under his wing now that Martin has retired. Thank you, said Frederick, picking up another harmonica. I wonder how long it will last, Ernst nodded towards the instrument. Sir, the star. It looks like the Star of David. And with Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the anti-Jewish cement is growing. There's already talk of removing it. I hate to see it go. Frederick tilted the harmonica to get a clear look at the company's emblem. 2 hands on either side of the circle around a 6-pointed star. He'd heard all of the theories about the star, that the 6 points represented the original owner, Matthias Honus, and his 5 sons, that the star was a replica of the ones carved on the church doors, that it was a leftover symbol from the harmonica companies Hamburg has purchased over the years, like Mensener, Ruiz. Had one of them been Jewish? Was it the Star of David? Ernst sighed, but it would be better for business. I suppose if it's no longer there, we can't risk offending customers. No matter where they are in the world, everyone has an opinion about the Jews. And being business what it is, Uncle Gunther frowned. Yes, it will probably be a casualty of politics, like so many things these days. Ernst blushed. Uncle Gunther proceeded to put a hand on Ernst's arms. Sir, please don't misunderstand. There are many who are grateful to you for what you've done. We need our jobs. Thank you, Ernst smiled politely. Well then, Uncle Frederick, Gunther, Frederick, carry on. After he left, Frederick asked, were some people to lose their jobs? Uncle Gunther leaned closer and spoke in a whisper. Ernst was visited by one of Hitler's officers. He was forced to officially join the Nazi Party if he had wished for the factory to stay in business. I've known him for years. He is not a Nazi. What would happen if he didn't join? Asked Frederick. For openly opposing Hitler's politics, he'd be sent to Dachau. It's full of opponents of Hitler. They call it a work and re-education camp, but it's a hard labor prison. There's a sign over the gate that says, work will set you free. It should say, work should set you 6 feet under the ground. But what would you do if you were him? Uncle Gunther turned to his table, shaking his head. Frederick resumed his work. What would he do? Would he become a Nazi, going against his own and father's beliefs that there was more than one way of thinking in this world, in order to save the jobs of thousands of workers? Would he become a Nazi to avoid prison and possibly his own death? He'd never thought of such circumstances. Regret and guilt jabbed at him as he realized he would probably do exactly what Ernst has done. As Frederick inspected and polished any number of harmonicas, he became preoccupied with the stars embezzled on the cover plates and their inevitable demise. Safe travels to you as well, he whispered. Won't you join me and the men? Asked Uncle Gunther. Then the lunch whistle blew. Frederick hurried off to take off his apron and grab his lunch pail. No thanks, Uncle. I have lunch mates. Uncle Gunther shook his head, waving him off. Your father told me about them. Go on then. But if only I might someday meet them. Or, better yet, eat them for dinner. Frederick grinned and ran from the factory. Knowing Uncle Gunther had only teased, he skirted around the building and came along a large grassy field to the edge of a pond. Beyond a dense wood loomed. Frederick slipped through the shrubbery to his favorite spot, where a tree blade fell on his side. He sat down. The 3-necked grebes walked out from the forest, rushing toward him. Frederick tossed bits of bread to his greedy friends. As he ate, a wind picked up. Dark clouds drifted overhead, obscuring the sun. The grebes' high-pitched quacking punctuated the air. Ladies, are you ready for my audience? Please use your best concert manners, said Frederick. The grebes ignored him, chirping and pecking at the crumbs. The pines rustled in a long, drawn-out swoosh from the nearby lumberyard. He heard the pinging of a hammer on metal. Quack, swoosh, swoosh, ping, 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 ping. Within the rhythms, Frederick heard Brahms' lullaby. He hummed the melody. He picked up a stick and closed his eyes and lifted his arms. He pictured the orchestra. His right hand kept the instruments bouncing on an invisible plane to bring in with strings, waving in the woodwind, flicking his wrists, ushering the brass, pointing to the harp. He opened his eyes and realized the music he had heard was not only in his mind. Someone was playing a harmonica. The notes were clear, the composition complex. When he slowed the tempo, the music slowed too.
When he increased, it quickened. A musician was following his direction. But from where? He looked around. There was no one about. He dropped his arm, yet the music continued. The lilt was slow, resonant, and haunting. One moment, one of the notes sounded as if they came from a flute, the next a clarinet. In the low notes, he could hear a cello. Frederick had never heard playing like this before. He listened, memorized, his eyes and ears searching to determine the origin of the sound. They settled on an open window of the uppermost floor of a warehouse across the field. He sucked in his breath. The graveyard. Frederick had never been there, but he'd heard all the tales. It's where machines go to die. Strange things happen in the shadows. There are glimmers and apparitions. Some people go up and never come down. Frederick hesitated, but the song was so compelling, so curious. How frightening could it really be? Besides, they were only rumors. He gathered his lunch, walked to the entrance, and left his pail on the threshold. Surely someone who made such music could not be a danger to him. He opened the heavy door and stepped inside the foyer. The music came from far above. Slowly he climbed a dim stairwell. At the very top floor, Frederick pushed open a door and entered a convious room. Floor to ceiling, arched windows ran from either side, but only a few needle-like gleams of light penetrated the years of grime on the glass, leaving the room in the shadows. Old machines, bulky figures of steel and iron filled the space. On the ceiling, dozens of wheels had been suspended, and below them the floor or attached to tables were their counterparts. All the elements of a once elaborate pulley system, the leather belts now disconnected and useless, dangled from the rafters like black snakes. It's where machines go to die. The music was louder now, but there was still no sign of a musician. The stale, dusty air made Frederick sneeze. The music stopped. "Hello?" he called. His word echoed. "Hello, hello." A mouse skidded across his path. The refrain from the lullaby picked up again. It seemed to come from the far corner of the room. The music was so insistent that it pulled him forward. Tears sprang to his eyes. Who played so beautifully and with such passion? He maneuvered around the deformed skeletons of machines. A large contraption covered with a dingy oilcloth blocked his view of the corner. He edged around it. Again the music stopped. He called out, "Please, show yourself." Once more he heard the lullaby. He peered into the dimness at the spot where he was certain the song had originated. No one was there. Frederick went to the window. He had seen it from the field, but he was sure it had been open. But now it wasn't. The glass dirty and opaque, like all the others. Spiderwebs draped the corners. The floor was covered with undisturbed carpet of dust. No one had stood there for quite some time. Glimmers and apparitions. Was it a ghost he heard, or someone playing a trick on him? Frederick turned and studied the immense space. The only way out was the way he had entered. No one could have slipped by him without notice. He opened it and removed the model that the company usually exported to the United States of America. The date in the box indicated the year it was introduced, but the overplate looked newer and the body older, opposite the side of which many blowholes, and on the black painted edge was a tiny red letter, M. Was this the instrument someone had been playing? If so, how? He had heard music, hadn't he? He felt a chill and shivered, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. His factory whistled drowned. Frederick jumped. Strange things happen. Some people go up and never come down. Quickly, he put the harmonica back into the box, slipped it into his chest pocket, and retracted his steps through the room. He scrambled down the stairs, tumbling the last few steps until he burst out the door. He had to bend over for a minute to catch his breath before grabbing his lunch pail and running back to the building. "Nephew, what happened? You look as pale as a ghost," said Uncle Gunther when Frederick reached his table. "I may have heard one," said Frederick, put his April and describing what had happened. "There's a logical explanation," said Uncle Gunther. "The sound of music is like water finding a path. It travels in many directions. It might have been an amplified sound coming from a different floor in the building." Frederick wasn't so sure. The music had felt so present, as if the harmonica wanted him to find it. "Do you suppose I could keep it?" "I don't see why not. The company gives us several each year." Frederick stepped closer and pointed to the red M. "What do you make of this?" Uncle Gunther studied it. It looks like a craftsman's mark, but not customary to do such a thing. It won't affect the sound. The instrument looks in good shape. Cover's plate been changed. There's no telling how long it was in the desk. Probably belonged to an employee from years ago. You'll want to clean and tune it. Uncle Gunther clapped him on the back. Frederick, my boy, you'll be a hero if the men don't find out you went to the graveyard alone. Most of them wouldn't dare. He walked home that evening. Frederick pulled the harmonica from his pocket and lifted it to his lips. He blew a few chords. Uncle Gunther was right. It was out of tune. But for now, Frederick didn't mind. He played the first few notes of Ali Vogel, Sond Schnoda. All the little birds are back. The harmonica had a rich, ethereal quality, the same alluring sound he had heard earlier in the graveyard room. The more he played, the more the air around him seemed to pulse with energy. He felt protected by the cloak of music, as if nothing could stand in his way. Was he just excited that Elizabeth was coming home and his family would be together again? Or was it something else? He had become so entranced by the tone of the harmonica and the simple hypnotic song that he had passed the schoolyard before he remembered to feel anxious, and turned down the block and realized he had walked almost all the way home without hunching over. He didn't even mind that Miss Von Gerber, the next-door neighbor who always bothered him with gossip or home remedies for his birthmark, was sweeping out in front of her generarium boxes. Instead of avoiding her as usual, he called out, "Hello, Mrs. Von Gerber." She stopped and said in surprise, "Good evening, Frederick." He waved and slipped the mysterious harmonica into his pocket. With every step of the front walk, it seemed to be a thump against his chest, like a heartbeat. We're on chapter 6 now, and I think we will stop here. We can finish it, well, not finish, but we can read more tomorrow. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed reading with me. And I hope that this has helped someone, at least have their mood brightened. Good night, everybody.